Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 and our Talks with Walt, as we are calling our work through the deathbed edition of Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We now turn to Song of Myself, passage number 10. Now we've said that sections 8 through 16 of Song of Myself are in large ways that great cataloging section where we're going to have all of these different things that the journalist, poet Whitman will see and will record. But here we're going to hear Whitman's bardic voice, and to some degrees this is going to be the ballad I voice, and we're going to talk more about that in a second. Now, my assumption is you've been following our stuff at LearnStrong.net, the Talks with Walt playlist down the left-hand side. We've messed around with the 24 poems of inscriptions as well as the 19 sections of Palmanock. Here, we're going to reference especially that passage 16, which was the most disturbing for us to have to talk about, because Whitman is going to have to own up to, and we have to help him own up to, the racism that will be a part of his own experience, obviously the collective. As well, though, to call Whitman a racist is going to be difficult after the passage that we'll read here. And as well, I'm hoping that you've messed around with Song of Myself from the introduction comments all the way up through passage number 9 that we just left. Well, that was a celebration of country and rural life playing, of course, in the grass that's been cut. Here, though, we're going to turn now to some powerful images. We're going to have 5 of them, starting from a mountain hunter to ultimately a freed slave. I just want to start, though, as we've sometimes done with Norton's and the annotated Norton's observation. Now, we're going to first of all hear about a famous at some point in this, going to hear about a famous painting, The Trapper's Bride, by the Baltimore artist Alfred Jacob Miller of 1810 to 1874. We're going to, in this section, however, recognize a good instance of Whitman's customary, as this is what, Norton says, mingling of his own experience with extrapolated experience like the bard or the balladeer of old, the clamming incident that we're going to read about from his actual youth, the runaway slave episodes probably experienced or witnessed, the imagined experience of the hunters from literary or actual hearsay, and the extrapolation of the Indian bride by the agency of a painting, all with this ballad I voice. Let's turn now. It's too long for me to read it and then come back to exegete, so we'll just go to work with each one of the 5. I'm hoping you have your own copy of this in front of you, and then you can number as we go. Image 1. It's interesting, it starts with the word alone. Alone far in the fields, because we're going to start this passage alone and we're going to end it with 2 together. The speaker of the poem, Whitman, assuming Whitman, and a runaway slave. Alone far in the wilds and mountains I hunt, wandering. Think about Odysseus as a wanderer, and then the use of this word. Amazed at my own lightness and glee. Now this word glee takes us back to the word play of, again, passage 4, as he called it a game, both in and out of the game, he says, and watching and wondering at it. There may be no better line, single line of all of Leaves of Grass to capture what Whitman's trying to do. Lightness and glee in the late afternoon, choosing a safe spot to pass the night. We immediately think of Thoreau's Walden. And think about it, 1854, Walden, this first published here, 1855, right? To pass the night, kindling a fire. It's a great image, right? Because, of course, in some ways, the phoenix is a powerful image that will permeate so much of what happens in Leaves of Grass. And broiling the fresh killed game. It's interesting that he uses the word game here. Of course, he's used it earlier. Obviously, it means the animal that he's taken. Falling asleep on the gathered leaves. You can see the game, obviously, that Whitman is playing with. Interestingly, in the 55 edition, originally, it was soundly falling asleep. There's a lot of interesting questions that we just can't get into as scholars, though it's fun to do this sometimes, to ask, why would he remove the adverb soundly for soundly falling asleep instead of just falling asleep? These are fun questions. On the gathered leaves, obviously we're playing the game now with more leaves from even preceding in passage 9. With my dog, we immediately think of Odysseus and Argos, and gun by my side. Now there's going to be firearms mentioned 2 more times, so we want to pay attention to it as well. And this thing about the proximity of the gun or the firearm. So that's our first image. The second image, we're going to jump now to Melville and Moby Dick. Think about your 1851 date, right? The Yankee clipper is under her in the original, it was the 3 sky sails. It's just your sky sails. She cuts the sparkle and scud. Great language, right? Great use of the day for the language, the marine language, right? My eyes settle the land, so now we're back to Odysseus looking, scanning to see Ithaca. I bend at her prow, the foremost area of the ship, right? And shout joyously from the deck. Here we are, back to more glee, back to more joy, obviously back to more games. Our second image. Our third image. The boatmen and clam diggers, now these are clammers, right, arose early and stopped for me. Notice the spelling of stopped here is not the original spelling of S-T-O-P-P-E-D, but now it's just the more arcane spelling. And notice the great I here. I tucked my trouser ends in my boots and went and had a good time. You should have been with us that day round the chowder kettle. Now, can you remember that in our lectures on the Odyssey at learnstrong.net, how many times we talked about how significant meals are in the Odyssey? Now, we have some of that in the Iliad and the Aeneid, but not as much as the Odyssey. The Odyssey loves to talk about how much fun it is to just have a great meal, and notice that this image will finish there. Now, to understand the next, and by the way, the next 2 are going to be more controversial, and obviously for any number of reasons, we're going to treat them with as much respect as we can. I want you to, though, go Google image a painting called The Trapper's Bride by Miller from 1845, because that's really what Whitman is playing with here. Now, we've already talked about Whitman's racism as it relates to Native American and indigenous peoples in starting from Paumanok Passage 16. If you haven't listened to that lecture, I recommend that you go back and do that and then come back to these observations. I saw the marriage of the trapper in the open air. Notice we're still outdoors, right? In the far west, we're back to where we were at the very beginnings of the mountains and the wilds in the mountains. The bride was a red girl. We've spoken, of course, already, and starting from Paumanok Passage 16 about Whitman and that assumed kind of racist view that will be a part of the culture at large. It doesn't forgive him, but we certainly need to understand it from that perspective. Her father and his friends sat near in 55 it was by, near cross-legged and dumbly smoking. Now, of course, the word dumbly can be, of course, quietly, can also mean stupid or whatever. You get to decide which one of those 2 you prefer here. They had moccasins to their feet, interestingly not on their feet, and large thick blankets hanging from their shoulders. Now, obviously, we're getting this kind of image that's taken almost powerfully right from the painting. On a bank of the river, lounged, interesting that word is used, given loaf is a popular word. Again, we're back to these echoes. I'm just pointing it out to you. On a bank lounged the trapper. He was dressed, again, the arcane spelling of dress, mostly in skins. His, obviously, the trapper is not native, right? His luxuriant beard and curls protected his neck. He held his bride by the hand. Now, just a couple of things I want to point out. The echoes that are so genius. I mean, at some point you kind of go, whoa, this is some really genius stuff. Notice back in passage 5, we had comments about beards and we had comments about feet. This passage will end with feet. We just heard about beards. Of course, curl, I've already told you, is a fascinating thing to run down. Curls, curly, we've seen it already before. And we commented on hair in the last passage, 9, as it relates to our study of Milton and Paradise Lost, or for that matter, the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Aeneid. Hair matters, and it's going to play games with Whitman as well. Protected his neck, he held his bride by the hand. Now, what's fascinating is the 1855 version of this, and again, this is why we have to at least point out that originally the language went like this: the other hand held firmly the wrist of the red girl. That was the original rendering, which makes this even a more disturbing passage than it already is, right? And then after, in the 55, after that, one hand rested on his rifle, which was also edited out, but takes us as well now back to an earlier, the gun by his side, and to the passage that we will end this with. That is to say, the firearm is a symbol of violence, no question, but it's also, in this poem, can be a symbol of unification and peace. We'll see that at the end here, right? Now, how about the girl? to finish this of the fourth images. She had long eyelashes, her head was bare. In other words, there seems to be this suggestion that she's not in any way feeling ashamed, bare head, right? We've seen that imagery already in Song of Myself. Her coarse, straight locks, here we are with more hair, descended upon her voluptuous limbs, is the way that Whitman will describe this. Again, if you look at the painting, you'll understand where he comes to this adjective voluptuous. And reached to her feet. And again, these echoes of passage 5, which at that point were erotic, here, of course, a little less of that, and yet there's an echo that I just want to point out for you. And then finally, the last of the scenes. Now, I just want to remind you that the Fugitive Slave Act, horrifically, Congress, requiring that freed slaves were returned, runaway slaves, were returned back to their owners, 1850. Think about your date of 1855, when this line will be, this series of lines will be read. And again, some people threw away Leaves of Grass, not because of passages like passage 5, but more of passages like this that are exactly in defiance of all things that the Fugitive Slave Act held to be important. Think about, for example, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which of course has that horrific history now, which is in so many ways really tragic because of the importance of that novel. Think about the date of 1852 for Uncle Tom's Cabin. Think about Thoreau, civil disobedience, and his abolitionist stance. We've obviously given lectures on these texts. 1854 is Thoreau's Walt. I mean, think about what was in the air. If 1854 is Walt, and 1855 is Whitman's Leaves of Grass, especially Song of Myself, this passage now becomes really powerful and, of course, problematic, no question. The runaway slave came to my house and stopped outside. The spelling, by the way, originally was S-T-O-P-P-D. Here it's the arcane spelling. I heard his motions crackling the twigs of the woodpile. In other words, hiding. Through the swung half door of the kitchen, I saw him, limpsy and weak. By the way, the word limpsy was spelled with an E in the 55, now spelled L-A-M-P-S-Y. Notice the I saw. In other words, we're looking, again, this voice of the bard, we're looking through the eyes now of the poet, or the speaker of the poem, to capture this sense of this runaway slave who is destroyed, sitting there ready to die, of course, in his final moments. And you can see through the swung half door of the kitchen. It's brilliant the way that Whitman constructs this. In other words, you're kind of seeing through the eyes of the poet. And, he continues, went, by the way, notice we're going to get a repetition of 5 ands for this anaphoria game that he loves to play. It's like, we're just telling the story. And went where he sat on a log, and led him in, and assured him, comforted him, and brought water, and filled a tub for his sweated body and bruised feet. Now, readers of Whitman's day would immediately recognize the echoes of the 10th chapter of Luke, the 25th verse through the 37th verse of what we will refer to often as the Good Samaritan story. What's the Good Samaritan story about? Well, it's about helping somebody. Yeah, of course. But it's about helping somebody who is the other, who is the foreign, and that's what's being echoed and referenced here. No question. And gave him a room that entered from my own. In other words, trust of the other is happening here. Think about those opening scenes of Moby Dick as well, where Ishmael and Queequeg will meet in a bed unexpectedly, and then of course they're definitely polar opposites in almost every way, and yet they become close dear friends. I mean, you could argue that Moby Dick is in fact a love story of a kind, no question about that. Notice, I gave him a room that entered from my own and gave him some coarse clean clothes, and remember perfectly well. Notice this is like after the fact, looking back. The key of remembrance is so important to our reading of Leaves of Grass. Remember perfectly well his revolving eyes and his awkwardness. That is to say, clearly the foreign in every way. And remember, putting plasters on the galls of his neck and ankles. Why? Well, because this is a runaway slave who has been enchained all his life. Right? And so Whitman, as this bardic voice, is saying, I'm helping him because he has escaped And of course the resonance is here is because of who he is. He's a man, he's a person. He deserves respect and help. He stayed, notice the spelling of stayed, S-T-A-I-D. It can also mean respectable, right? It's interesting Whitman would choose this word. He stayed with me a week before he was recuperated. Think about how that word works, for example, with our study of Thoreau's Walden. And passed north. Think about that as it relates, of course, to Uncle Tom's Cabin. I had him sit next to me at table. In other words, equality. My firelock leaned in the corner. In other words, I had a firearm, but I didn't worry about needing it. There it was in the corner, and this is our third reference to rifles. Although in the deathbed edition, the Trapper's Bride section does not actually have the reference of the rifle as it does in the original 1855. Well, what are we going to say about all of these as powerful, powerful images, all 5 of them? Well, at 2A, obviously we need to learn to see the other, to understand the whatever we might qualify as the foreign. And this is where Whitman is going. Hey guys, this is some radical stuff at the conclusion of passage 10, no question, for Whitman and for his readers. Wait, what are you saying? Are you suggesting that a runaway slave needs to be helped and the law needs to be broken? That is exactly what Whitman is saying, but it's far more profound than that. He's speaking about the whole notion of respectability, of treating each other and all of us as equals. It's a powerful, powerful thing. At 2B, again, we mentioned the anaphoria. And the ways, of course, at 3A, that we've got all these allusions that are happening. The Trapper's Bride from 1845, Moby Dick of 1851, obviously Uncle Tom's Cabin of 1852, Walden of 1854, and then, of course, Leaves of Grass and Song of Myself in 1855. It is an amazing thing to consider that this is what precedes, of course, the American Civil War. Finally, at 3B, like we asked in our last one, because these are all these images, which one for you is the one that moves you the most compelling? And which one for you is the one that's the most disturbing for you? And obviously, there's good reasons to be disturbed for any number of these images that we're looking at. Let's move on now in our scene, right, to passage 11. And this is the famous voyeur scene, as it's sometimes referred to, watching a bunch of guys go swimming. Thank you.